Absolute Martian Manhunter is amazing, and there's a reason we waited for the second issue instead of just covering the first. But what this does is this opens up with basically Detective John Jones dying. Now, what's interesting about this is that unlike what we're traditionally used to, John Jones is not what the Martian Manhunter becomes. Instead, there's something much different going on here. But as he's basically laying dying, he seemingly just recovers, right? And then, of course, he ends up talking to a doctor who's kind of filling him in on the damage that he sustained as a result of the injury that almost killed him. And the doctor tells him, right, I was saying that your scans look good, a little swelling of the brain, like concussion, take a week or two off from work and come in if you start experiencing headaches, nausea, vomiting, visions, confusion, etc. I just don't want to push it. What's going to be kind of crazy about this is he's going to experience all those things. And in fact, he already does, because initially what happens is he starts smoking in the hospital, which is a big no-no. But he also has this vision of an explosion. And so where the doctor's like, you can't do that, right? You're not supposed to smoke in here. He's like, well, then where's all this smoke coming from? But it's not some gray, misty substance. It's all in varying colors. More so than that, as he's talking with his wife, she's kind of flabbergasted by everything the doctor was talking about. But what he discusses are things the doctor didn't say, right? His wife is having an affair and he doesn't know what to do about it. The poor guy still loves her. But where the doctor hadn't really revealed any of that information, John was picking up on it. He was effectively reading his mind, right? And his wife even goes so far as to say that there's no way he could recover this fast, right? The building he was in exploded. So again, providing a bit of context to the scenario that led to him encountering the Manhunter in the first place. But again, a lot of this is kind of mysterious and cloak and dagger, because what this does is it puts off this idea that maybe there's some kind of schizophrenia going on, right? Some kind of mental illness going on with John Jones, because he starts to see this multicolored smoke. He starts to look at the lighter and sees it's completely changing into a different color. That when he looks at somebody's fingernails, when he looks at the hair on the judge, that when he's having this conversation, right, with his own superiors, that suddenly everything around him starts to shift and change. The conversation with his superiors is particularly important because that comes off the heel of a conversation with his wife where she wants to go on a vacation, right? That he needs a kind of break from everything that's going on, especially after a near-death experience. But when he's talking to his superiors, he's like, no, like, I want to work, right? I don't really want to go anywhere. I don't want to take a vacation. And so they more or less sideline him and they hand the whole explosion over to somebody else, if for no other reason than he's essentially compromised. And so on the surface, it would seem like a good idea for him to investigate it because he would want to get to the heart of the matter and how it all happened. But the fact is, because he's emotionally compromised, he wouldn't be able to be impartial to the investigation, which is really what's required here. But he kind of muses to himself along the way. He explains what it is that he does. He says that he's part of the stochastic terrorism task force, that they try to understand why people do the things they do, to predict dangerous behavior, identify individuals that pose a threat to the public, and stop them before they do something that hurts themselves or others. That it's a little like trying to read minds, that they're like those fortune tellers at carnivals, the psychics on late night TV, and about as accurate. And he says the problem is you can never really know someone not like they know themselves. But that's where you find out he's actually being watched by the Manhunter. And the Manhunter speaks in a kind of broken language, right? Martian, distant, different, alien, that kind of thing. And so what he starts to realize is that things around him are somewhat strange, right? As he's investigating the explosion, he's investigating potentially the person who caused it. He says you look for warning signs. And as he's talking to Miss Miller, she's giving him what little information she can. And he says, how do I know the bomber's mother hates pickles, that she always gave hers to him, right? How do I know that the bomber and his lifelong best friend made love one summer and never spoke of it again, not even to each other? How do I know the bomber's neighbor is telling the truth, but trying to hide her near daily use of cannabis? And so as he goes through, right, he says, you look for identifiable patterns, anything to make the world not random. That's what stochastic means, random. And he says, but how do I know? And so again, this whole situation has created something of a rift between himself and his wife, that he's almost separated, that they're almost estranged to a degree, not in the sense that they're just sort of two individual people occupying the same home, neither one having anything to do with the other. It's more that it's just kind of a difficult situation because he comes back and she's like, so no vacation? And he's like, no vacation. But clearly he's lying to her, that his superiors told him to take a vacation. And he's the one that rejected the idea, that he wants to get to the the bottom of it all. But when he's looking down at the cutting board, right, where his wife is cutting vegetables, he sees the Manhunter, memory of living music, dancing in daffodil light, abstracted canyons beyond physical and form, waves of quantum foam gently lapping. Again, it's this kind of crazy, weird, disembodied type situation. When he's talking to his son, who he is a little distance from, again, he kind of sees the Manhunter. That when he's created these kind of clay models of, the family and everything, he's like, well, I mean, where am I at, right? Where's daddy? He shows him what's basically Martian Manhunter. And so he says, I stay awake all night, trying not to think of the smoke, of what's waiting for me in it. Have you ever tried not to think of something? It's all you can think of. And so again and again and again, this situation presents itself when he's in the doctor's office, right, getting some measure of a checkup, right? After this, the possible aortic dissection in 3, then the knife wound in 7, shattered pelvis in 4, and right, it's just kind of this nonsensical, almost schizophrenic type thing, right? Is he losing his mind? Is he hallucinating all these things? Not only that, as he goes to visit the mother of presumably the bomber, he says as she speaks, she starts to smoke, not like a cigarette, but she herself starts to smoke. Steam pours out of her ears like an angry cartoon. I breathe it in. I breathe in and inhale Mike Miller's first day of school, all dressed up, adorable and terrified and full of potential, overwhelming feeling of love and pride, plus him picking flowers for his mother's birthday, and the crushed look on his face the day I told him his father wouldn't be coming home. No, I didn't tell him, she told him, right? That kind of thing. He's inhaling people's memories, right? He's picking up on people's memories. And so he kind of staggers out of the place. And then he ends up kind of going out into the city, and he sees all these streams of colors coming out of people's heads. And this is when it all kind of starts to make sense. And again, this is why I waited till issue 2, because the first one is just bonkers. Deniz Camp is crazy. I don't know. But again, he says, I have to get out of here, have to clear my head. Memory of buying your first house, real estate agent saying, real fixer-upper, lot of potential. And so quite literally, the memories of John Jones are being accessed by the Manhunter as John Jones is trying to understand what in the world is going on. He's like, no matter which way I walk, there's smoke everywhere. And then you chime back, memory of your dad finding cigarettes under your mattress saying, and where there's smoke, there's fire, right? He says the smoke is coming off of librarians and social workers and corporate lawyers. It's spewing out of accountants and couriers and construction workers, dancing tapestry of multicolored scars. It's the people. The people are all on fire, and no one seems to be bothered by it. And the smoke is filled with barroom laughter and office drama and grocery lists and someone's sainted mother saying, please, I don't understand. Like the Manhunter says, thought smoke ideas, oxidizing in the open air. Breathe in, breathe in, breathe in. And where he describes the Manhunter as green, right? Even describing the voice as green. He says, how can a voice be green? But it is. The voice is green, and it's waiting for me, always waiting for me. I can feel it following me 2 strides behind. I look around for some place to rest, but Middleton is like an alien planet. Fire hydrants, the arrangements and purpose of roads, my own reflection, all mysterious to me. And that's where he kind of starts to break a little bit, right? What's happening? Because as he's roaming down the street, everything around him is shifting and changing. What you're seeing here is how he sees things, right? What's happening to me? And that's where he's told, hidden life dimensions, observed and remove, view from the outside. And he says, I run in what I hope is a direction. What I hope is a way. I pass a police station and it's incomprehensible. And he's like, what is this, right? Who is that? Who's talking? And the Manhunter says, you, me, we are talking. And he says, remember, man on fire, human flame. The smoke, what waited. And so it essentially flashes back, right? It's the idea that the Manhunter is the one that saved him from dying. And so as absolutely insane and chaotic as this first issue is, Deniz Camp finally does us a solid and makes sense out of the second one. Because what this does is this initially picks up with a guy who's just shot a couple inside this house. And as he's standing in front of this kind of wall, right, with all this alien paraphernalia, in the middle is a depiction of a white Martian. Now, people who are familiar with the Martian Manhunter mythos immediately know the deal behind this. For those of you guys who are not, there are different interpretations of how the white Martians came to be in the Manhunter mythos. The most generally accepted interpretation, as far as I'm aware, comes from Grant Morrison's JLA run. And the idea is that at one point, there were no green Martians or, white Martians or even blue Martians. There were simply just the Martian race. The burning is what they would call it. And they would procreate using fire. But because of how dangerous they were and how warlike they were, the Guardians of the Universe, the ones who created the Green Lanterns, they actually split the burning race into several different races, right? The green, the blue, and the white. And then in turn, they gave them an inherent fear of fire in order to make sure they could never actually use fire in order to procreate. And so that's why you end up having the peaceful green Martians, which is where Martian Manhunter's from, and the warlike white Martians who were always looking to destroy Martian Manhunter and seemingly conquer the Earth. And so again, there are different interpretations of this. The New 52, for example, has its version, but again, most people seem to really be a fan of the JLA version from Grant Morrison's run. But what matters is this, right? As he takes out a cigarette and he lights it, he's kind of come to terms with what he's seeing. And in fact, the Manhunter actually starts to manifest with him for the first time, instead of being this disembodied ghost trying to understand its purpose and trying to understand the nature of John. Because what it tells him is what happens in your head also happens. And initially, John's just kind of like, Martians? Really? That's what all this is. And so initially, the Manhunter kind of talks to him and says, resistance is futile, but not how you think. And John doesn't want to hear it, right? He's like, dude, stop talking to me. But everywhere he goes, the Manhunter appears. And it's kind of funny. He's appearing as a stop sign. He's appearing in a newspaper article, right? It's just kind of nuts, right? He's like, none of this makes sense. Leave me alone. And that's where the Manhunter's like, understanding comes later. Total, complete, full understanding would result in mind self-destruction. So if I told you everything you needed to know now, your mind would literally shut down. You wouldn't be able to handle it. You have to come to terms with it on your own. You have to process it in a way that your brain can handle. And so that's where the Manhunter touches his face and he says, memory of honeymoon with Bridget, lying exhausted, content, close in warmth of leaf fractured light, everything just as it's supposed to be, the world still making sense, smell of mom baking famous cinnamon rolls after school, the no-fail remedy for bad days, which is true. Cinnamon rolls solve all of life's problems. Taste of serotonin, oxycodone, chemicals humans haven't discovered yet, flooding the brain. And he says, and suddenly I am calm. The panic subsides. And so I wouldn't go so far as to say the Manhunter is manipulating him. The Manhunter is seemingly learning as much about John as John's learning about him. And they're learning this in real time. So they're discovering each other and what they stand for in real time. And he says, a Martian, we've been to Mars. We have pictures and there are no aliens up there. You're not from Mars. You're from too much pressure on my brain. And that's where the Manhunter says, forgive me, us, yourself. Not Martian, not literal. Symbol, outline of best fit. Martian concept, constellation, alien, different, far away. And that's when he starts to pick up on what's really going on here. The Martian Manhunter is not actually from Mars, that he doesn't know exactly where he's from, and even the explanation is a little iffy, right? He says, somewhere so distant the universe will burn out before light from Earth can reach it, a place beyond places, playground of pure, radiant thought. So seemingly the source, right? Maybe. We know that the absolute universe only came into existence because Darkseid created it. So it's also entirely possible that the place that Martian Manhunter comes from is outside of the absolute universe, the main DC universe. Now, I'm not aware of Martian Manhunter having a comic book and having any involvement in the main DC universe right now. So it's entirely possible that's the case. It's also entirely possible I missed something, right? So I think it's important to preface that, right, and to add that thought in. But the fact is, right, that the Martian Manhunter does not come from Mars. It's the form he chose because it's the form best understood by the human race. After all, how many movies have you heard about or seen of Martian invaders coming to Earth, right? It's like the one form of alien that we as human beings can process and handle if we actually saw it. And he says, we must go, John. The parents are already dead. He will soon decide on Serta Street. What happens in your head also happens. And so in effect, what he's telling him is, I am showing you visions of things that are happening right now. Now that falls in line with Martian Manhunter in DC's main universe, that for the most part his powers are psionic outside of shapeshifting. And if Grant Morrison's JLA is to be believed, it's one of the very few instances where Superman admits that Martian Manhunter is more powerful than he is. But Martian Manhunter was almost kind of the alert system for the Justice League. And in fact, in times when communication devices were compromised and the Justice League couldn't rely on, in-ear communication and so on and so forth, the Martian Manhunter would link them together. Or if there was a large enough crisis that the Justice League had to work in unison, the Martian Manhunter would do the same thing. But he's also the guy that can tell them, this is what's happening on the Earth right now, and it's happening right over there, right? So almost a kind of cosmic awareness. But John doesn't understand that. He doesn't really get what's going on. And in fact, he ends up seeing a baby in a stroller that is the Martian Manhunter. And he starts screaming at it, right? Like, what do you want? Why are you here? Right? And the Martian Manhunter's just like, we are mind, hunt, kill, save, redeem, healer. And so in essence, while John is kind of wrapped up in the panic and the chaos of it all, it's the Martian Manhunter telling him, I'm here to help you. I'm here to solve what's happening with your world. Because that's when it all starts to come into play. Because John asks the question, under attack from what? And the Manhunter says, investigate, open your eyes, see people clearly for the first time. And so what you get here is this almost they live type of situation, right? Where Roddy Piper and Keith David are fighting in the alley and Roddy Piper's like, put on the glasses, like he makes them put the glasses on and he sees the world as it is for the very first time. The reality is that this world here that John Jones is a part of is not the world he knows. It's not the world he sees. He walks down the street and he sees, business signs and so on and so forth. But again, when the reality sets in and he sees the world as it is, it's a world that uses subliminal messaging to promote violence, hate, fear, despair, paranoia, rage, everywhere, right? And literally Martian Manhunter tells him evidence, socio-toxic buildup of quote unquote bad vibes. And that's where, at that point, John's like, bad vibes? Really? And the Manhunter says, process naturally occurring in unstable, unequal societies, but recent exponential increase implies outside intervention. Inescapable conclusion, complete psychoplanetary collapse imminent. Responsible entity or entities must be hunted, killed, and you must be saved, redeemed, healed. So basically, someone's causing this. Someone's spiraling the world into chaos. Yes, there is also always some measure of inequality in any society whatsoever. It's inescapable, right? There is no such thing as a perfect equality. But in this instance, someone is taking the human race's perception of that and exacerbating it, making it worse, and sending humanity on this collision course where people will ultimately destroy themselves out of irrational thoughts and feelings. And so that's why he says, we must go. Program already in progress. Trigger will soon reach Serta Street. And so he asks the question, he says, what is this, right? Why am I experiencing this? Why have you chosen me? I don't understand. And again, the Manhunter says, repeat, cannot understand, not yet. Consciousness expansion, upgrade in progress. Martian vision is only the beginning, because what he does is he kind of pulls in some of the memories of John Jones when he was a little kid and he was looking through the peephole at the fence and checking out the neighbor's seemingly fantastic legs. But he warns him and he tells him, something is coming. Somebody here is manipulating things. You have to get over there and you have to stop what's about to happen, because what happens here is you pick up with Trigger, this individual person who's walking around what is a little part of town called Old Damascus, and he starts shooting the place up. But in the process, he kind of talks to himself, right? He says, invaders, aliens from outer space, body snatchers wearing human faces, human skin. Now, these are all the thoughts of Trigger that are being fed into John Jones, because again, the natural abilities of Martian Manhunter is telepathy. But even John himself almost kind of tries to disregard everything. But ultimately, he's just sort of like, okay, let's see if there is truth to this, because if I'm being told that there's a guy who's getting ready to shoot a place up in Little Damascus, it might just be worth investigating. It might be worth looking into, even if it's fake. And so finally, they catch up to it. It's also him kind of leaning in and accepting the idea that maybe this whole Martian Manhunter thing really is what's going on. And so that, again, is when you pick up with Trigger, right? They seem to look and think like us, but they're just pretending, walking around, hoping we won't notice. Well, I noticed. I saw. And he says most of the time they get the color wrong. And when they try to speak our language, it comes out all funny. It's pretty obvious once you know what you're looking for. And again, as he's approaching these people and spraying them down, he says, in my experience, 99% of people are just pretending. Welcome to Earth. And so seemingly he's convinced that there are aliens that are taking over the human race. Now, under any normal circumstance, you and I would consider that to be schizophrenia, but there is an actual thing going on, right? It's not just paranoid schizophrenia. There's something bigger happening, because when John gets here, he immediately looks around, and because of the powers of Martian Manhunter, he's fed the thought process of Trigger, as well as the thought processes of the people who lay dying. And it's a pretty crushing experience, right? The final thoughts of a person whose life is ending. Fear over the fact that they never did everything they ever wanted to do. Fear over the fact that the entire life they spent believing in a life after death may have been for nothing because they don't really know what's on the other side. And if they do follow some religious conviction, did they live their life in a way that fell in line with that religious conviction, i.e., are they going to go to hell? These are the kind of things that people are terrified of from the Martian Manhunter and John's perspective. And so what happens is that with the Manhunter jumping into Trigger's head, it gives the Manhunter the ability to kind of poke around and see what's going on, as well as feed information to John that allows him to neutralize the situation, right? Martian Manhunter is swimming through his mind, investigating. I know he loves bananas and deer hunting with his dad every season since he was 7. I know the name of his first grade best friend. And he says, Toomis, it's me, Clyde Toomis, right? Cutting hands, making themselves brothers one summer. And that initially stops Trigger dead in his tracks. And he's like, Toomis, right? Like, how long has it been? I hardly recognize you, right? So he's lying, he's faking all of this, right? But it does give him the ability to, at the very least, stop what Trigger's doing. And so that's where Trigger's like, is it really you? Right? Is it really what's going on? Now, the whole time, right, almost like a person investigating a cave or a tunnel, the Martian Manhunter's digging through all the thoughts of Trigger, right, trying to understand what's happening, what's going on. And ultimately, he figures out what's actually happening here, right? He figures out what's taking place. Now, cops arrive on the scene, and right off the bat, John tells them, like, stop, chill, right? Hold on, do not fire on this guy. And that's where he's fed information from Manhunter. And Manhunter says inside Trigger's mind, the Martian has found something. Level 18 delusion hallucination, brain rotter, invasion coded classic, us versus them architecture, very delicate destruction and construction. And with John sort of analyzing this on his own, he says it's wired together from old movies and old fears and culture going back. That in reality here, Trigger's family has a history of schizophrenia, and that Trigger himself is struggling with schizophrenia. But again, much like what John has seen out there in the world and the violent tendencies that people are engaging in, it's not inherent to the stress and anxieties that come with living in a society with varying degrees of equality, that someone is exacerbating it. And so in turn, once this whole virus is basically destroyed by Martian Manhunter, that Trigger kind of wakes up and it's just like, what have I done? Like, what is this? Like, he doesn't really understand what's happening, but it makes no difference because he's shot through the head by one of the cops and killed on the spot. But the other part of this is that with Manhunter kind of observing all of this, that he looks into the dying thoughts of Trigger, scans them for the very last time. And when Trigger was standing in front of that giant sign with that white Martian, that had entered into his brain. So seemingly, the white Martians are invading humanity, possessing individuals, and exacerbating the existing problems within the human race's culture and civilization. And so once John gets back, the Manhunter tells him, danger, disaster, doom. Worst possible finding, worse than feared. The white Martian has come to end humankind. Not only that, what seems to actually be going on here is that John Jones, as we see him in his human form, is not actually his human form, that he is literally and physically the Martian Manhunter. That's the reason why his son made him the way that he did. So again, it's wild. It's a phenomenal comic, but it's wild. But things don't really make any sense until you get to the second issue. So again, that's why we waited to cover it. So what this does is, as brutal as it sounds, this opens up with a homeless guy sleeping on the street who's immediately immolated. Right? And we get the statement from John Jones where he says, even though he lived on the streets since he was 14, Big Al's last thought was, I want to go home. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about Martian Manhunter in the Absolute Universe is that it's different from what we're used to, right? Martian Manhunter in the main DC universe, where he has telepathy, your traditional powers, and in, JLA 98, Superman admitted that Martian Manhunter was stronger than him. But outside of that, right, in the Absolute Universe, John Jones and Martian Manhunter are two distinctly different people, and we don't really know that much about Martian Manhunter. All we know is that it possessed John Jones and basically kept him from dying, and now operating as a detective, which that's what he was doing when he was shot and almost killed, he kind of goes through solving various crimes. But the color streams that you see emanating off of people, those are their thoughts combined with their emotions. But one of the things we saw in the last video is that the white Martians are emerging. And this is kind of giving us a much better understanding of that, because John Jones continues on and he says, Big Al had not had a home to go to in 20 years, but it's all he could think through the heat and the pain. I want to go home. And so the question's asked here, right? How many victims? It turns out it's 24. And it says how many perps? Also 24. And John asked the question, were they all killed at the same time? And that's where he's met, right? Where he's told it's a tragedy. Right? And so again, that's where he kind of continues on. He says, gray clouds gather at the edges. You can almost make out the shapes of people if you squint. And that's where Manhunter chimes in. And he says, radiant and restrained grief, smudged, spectacular expressions of life. Eventually, everything goes up in smoke. And that's why I say they're two distinctly different people, because they all kind of have their internal monologue on what's going on, right? John Jones says they know the score, and that's where this guy here says it is weird. I'll give you that. I mean, 24 people setting 24 separate sleeping bums on fire at exactly the same time. Figured it was some kind of cult or something, but they claim they don't know each other and there's nothing saying different. And so the question is, why? And that's where Martian Manhunter says the same wrong question. You keep asking the wrong question. Now, again, a lot of what he says is kind of broken English because he's still figuring out the English language. So John doesn't necessarily know how to interpret everything he says perfectly. Also keep in mind here, Martian Manhunter is seemingly in his head. The indication at the end of the last comic was that they can kind of switch interchangeably, right? So one could sort of replace the other. But the idea of the Martian Manhunter laying in bed was likely just a kind of metaphorical statement, more than a literal one. But again, this statement remains. As to why it was they did this, people are mostly crazy and do terrible things to each other for no reason at all. And the question's asked, is that your professional opinion, Detective Mayweather? And he says, yes. And the response of John, then you should think about changing professions. Now, because of the fact that John Jones has telepathy that comes with the abilities of the Martian Manhunter, he can hear the thoughts of other people. So he kind of knows what they're thinking. But a lot of what's manifesting here is, at least as far as the visual component, again, the colors of their thoughts, which usually are synonymous with their emotional state. Red being anger, green being more benign or calm, blue just being completely relaxed, maybe even a little hopeful. But John continues on here. He says, I really mean it. The job is leaching into him like asbestos, making soft things hard. If he keeps going this way, 6 years from now, his kids will find him beating his wife to death with a golf club in the garage. And he says, I know I sound crazy. I know that. But the Martian who lives in my head assures me that I'm not. Now, this is what's so wild here, is because this kind of toys with the idea of schizophrenia. And if we were not really given the whole plot with like the white Martian who's seemingly possessing people, at least that seemed to be the case, then this would really just be a story that would walk the lines, almost like the original Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee century, right? Like, is he crazy? Is he sane? Is he somewhere in between? And he's just basically self-medicating self-medicating with alcohol or drugs. It could be any number of things. And that's what makes the comic so wonky. Such as it is, we kind of have an idea of what's going on here, right? It really is a Martian possessing John Jones, and then the white Martians are on their way. And that's where the Martian Manhunter even chimes in as John Jones is examining the crime scene, and he says, the emancipation of the immolated. Now that's going to come back, and that's a phrase that I want you to keep in the back of your head because it will become important at the end of this story. But again, Mayweather continues on. He says, I don't understand these people. Why don't they just go to the sunny side? At least there, they would be safe. And because of the fact that John Jones, through Martian Manhunter, can pick up on the residual thoughts of people even after they've passed away, almost like their thoughts sort of linger in the immediate vicinity, he kind of chimes in on what was going on with Big Al, offering a little more insight than he would traditionally know, where he says Big Al didn't like shelters. People were always messing with him there, making dark intimations, stealing his shoes while he slept. He liked his chances better on the street. And that's where Mayweather's like, I mean, do you know this guy? Because you're referring to him as Big Al. That's a nickname. A nickname is reserved for somebody that you know varying degrees better than like an acquaintance or something like that, right? Some variation of being a friend. And so at that point, you switch over to John Jones interviewing these various people and asking them different questions. And he says 24 individuals who claim not to know each other, but who, in perfect unison, burned 15 men, 6 women, and 3 children alive. None have criminal records. All of them had reasons. And that's what's kind of crazy, is because what we end up finding out here when he's interviewing these various people is that they actually all started to kind of hallucinate something. This woman says, I've never done anything like this before in my life. I just got the sudden urge. Another woman says, I had this flash that the homeless guy was my father. He used to come into my room at night and probably did terrible things. And again, that's where Martian Manhunter kind of chimes in with his broken English, right? He says, must move quickly, extinguish every ember, every spark. Pre-existing conditions, tragedy, isolation, genetic predispositions, trauma, proclivities, all of them being used like kindling. Every single one of these people are victims. Because what John Jones says is he says, some felt remorse, others didn't. The only thing they had in common was the cloud around their heads. Now again, because of the fact that Martian Manhunter allows John Jones to see things that he doesn't normally see, this all seems to indicate they are all under the influence of the white Martian, but we still don't quite know how far-reaching this goes. And so John continues on. He says, you know that little voice in the back of your head constantly telling you that the world is going to end? Mine is not just a voice. The best I can describe it is that it's somewhere between a color, a feeling, and a philosophy, but it's still getting the hang of language. And that's where you switch back over to Manhunter, and he says, mankind's last gasp, tragic and glorious, gaudy, gorgeous funeral march, civilization's closing, ceremonies beautiful to behold, gawkward, co-inefficient, imprecise. The things mean sounds and the sounds mean things, round and round. And that's what John Jones is referring to when he says Martian Manhunter is still getting the feel of language. He doesn't quite understand how the English language works, so he doesn't really know exactly what words to use to explain how he feels. And that's why John Jones says it's getting worried that I'm not getting its point across. So the walk from the driveway to the front door of my house becomes an incomprehensible alien apocalypse. It's literally all these multicolored beings destroying each other, eradicating each other. And what Martian Manhunter is really trying to illustrate here is effectively global civil war. But it's not like nation against nation. It's not a political civil war. It's every human being destroying every other human being. And he says, I should really see someone about all of this. And he even goes so far as to speak publicly here. He says, I get what's going to happen. You've made it very clear. What I don't get, what you won't explain, is why. Why does this white Martian want to destroy anything? What did we do to it? And the response of the Manhunter is really fascinating here, because he says, the white Martian has decided on tragedy. I can make it no clear. And John asks the question, you can't or you won't? And the Manhunter says, I can't. Analogy, explain the criminal justice system to a sunflower seed. Make a paramecium understand prosperity. Lay out prisons to a pebble. Do you understand? You can't. And what it's really basically saying here is that I could explain to you what's happening, but the reality is you couldn't process it if I did. Now, exactly what he means here, we don't fully know. It could simply just be that in order for John Jones to truly understand why the White Martian is doing what it's doing, that Manhunter would have to expose John Jones to telepathy, right? Some telepathic vision or something along those lines, which could easily overwhelm him, right? Or it would be like showing him colors that human beings simply are not able to see. And as a result, he wouldn't see anything at all. So again, it's really kind of wild, right? In terms of how these two relate to one another. And that's why he continues to say, it says it comes from somewhere so far away, it doesn't make sense to speak in terms of distance. So I do not talk about it at all. And the Manhunter kind of continues on. He says, White Martian is cosmic, predator, creator, ironist, destroyer, 100,000 life worlds lost. White's great purpose, its delight. Talk to Bridget, spend time with Tyler, breathe deep your life, John Jones, while you can. The White Martian has decided on tragedy. And so you end up switching over to this really beautiful moment. This actually incredible and very thought-provoking, because what ends up happening is that John Jones says, I sit at home and the air is thick with the things we think, but do not say. And so he's on one side and his wife is on the other, right? Physically, this is designed to represent the distance between the two of them. It's a metaphorical representative of the fact that they've effectively drifted apart. And the things that they're thinking but don't say are things like, our old friends don't talk to us. I feel like I barely know him. He took the transfer without asking, moved us here without asking. Why won't he talk to me? If I leave, we can stay with my mother. What's ironic here is that most of these thoughts are his wife, Bridget. She's thinking all these various things, but she never really vocalizes any of them. And what makes this so ironic is that in a lot of ways, these are what are called bids. And for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with that, right, the whole Gottman Institute study of relationships for 30 years, in every relationship, an individual will initiate what's called a bid. So if your partner's like sitting on the couch and they look out the window and it's like, man, those birds are beautiful, that's a bid. They're trying to get you to look at the birds that they're looking at and then engage them in that particular moment. It's like if your girlfriend sits down and just huffs, right? Well, clearly she wants to talk about something, and I guess instead of using her words, she just does that instead. But the fact is, right, that everybody does this in some capacity. Friends, coworkers, people who are lovers. It all kind of works the same way. But when these bids are not acknowledged because a person is simply not paying attention, because the person's mind is drifting off to something else, if it happens enough times, it can start to create a rift. So much so that Gottman's actually predicted breakups and divorces 90-something% of the time based on missed bids. So it is really an important thing when it comes to that. But I say all that to say that John and his wife really are drifting apart, because with everything else that he's contending with right now, what he's not doing is extending an olive branch. He's not leaning into her and having that conversation with her. And so that's why he says, I open the window to let in some light and air. And then he almost starts to talk to her, but then he kind of has a flashback by way of Martian Manhunter, right? Memory of Special Agent Sutter's disappointing face saying, why'd you have to go and do it, kid? And so really it's just kind of like the idea that his job seemingly takes precedence over everything else. And so he just simply says, I'm going to go check on Tyler, and then leaves to go upstairs. Tyler's in his room. And in fact, this is an example of a bid where she says he's in his room. It's a way of her basically saying he's fine where he is. We could simply just talk, but without actually vocalizing that, and because he's simply just not really reading between the lines, ultimately it all goes missing. And so he ends up in Tyler's bedroom, but then his phone starts to ring, and the Martian Manhunter is like, you should take that. And that's when John picks it up. He gets a call. He's told from somebody something's happening, and he's like, I'm just stepping outside. And when he gets out to his street, the entirety of the city is engulfed in the abilities of the White Martian, meaning all these people are being influenced by it. And that's where the Manhunter says the emancipation of the immolated. And so again, Jones continues on. He says they call Middleton the city of second chances. And it can be. But a woman kind of comes walking up on him after this whole huge fire broke out, right? He says the woman in the stained nightgown is still in shock. Hard to imagine. all that she's lost. She lost her husband and her 3 children, right? They died in this fire. He says even now, the love she feels for her children hits like a blast furnace. You could incinerate diamonds with it. And he says strangers were burning down strangers' homes. People were burning down their own homes. A gang of kids burned their beloved playground down. And that's when he asks, how do you stop this? It's just random people setting random fires. But that's when Martian Manhunter chimes in and he says, no such thing as random, only misunderstood, which is a very profound statement when you think about it. And he says, open my eye, John. See, the inside is outside is all sides. See the implicate order of everything. Martian vision, the absolute perspective. What do you see now? And he says, I see home, not just mine, all of them, every home that ever was or will be anywhere on the planet. That's what it wants. That's what it's trying to burn down. Not any specific home or even all homes, but the idea of home. And that's where Manhunter says the place you go inside yourself, concept, stellation, home, safety, shelter. And so again, that's what's so cool about this, is because this really is Martian Manhunter providing telepathy and empathy to John Jones. And this is how he experiences it. It's a very realistic and artistic and a little exotic perspective on how these things work. Normally, whenever it comes to things like telepathy or something like that, it's literally just thought clouds. It's like some kind of a comic book text bubble. But by providing this really exotic artistic rendering of it, it becomes so incredible, because he says the Sunnyside Hotel is Middleton's largest homeless shelter. That's what the White Martian is going after. Specifically, that's what he's sending people after. And it's the smartest maneuver. If you're some kind of an alien and you're looking to conquer or destroy a world, you do not show up in your form and attack everybody, because even if only out of fear and nothing else, they will attack you, right? People attack what they do not understand. But if what you do is you turn the people into the enemy, you turn the people into the bad guys, you possess them, force them to operate against their own wills, and they destroy everything around them, then how do you contend with that, right? And so again, that's where John Jones picks up the phone, basically calls the cops and the fire department and is like, the Sunnyside Hotel, that's the target. Everybody needs to get down there. And he says they call it the Sunnyside Hotel so that when families have to leave their kids' homes, they can tell the kids they're going to the hotel, like it's a vacation resort instead of a desperate last one. And he says most are running from something: poverty, persecution, abuse, addiction, responsibilities, disaster, despair. They've all got a reason, and they're all different. Now, this is one of the other cool things too, is because the White Martian basically appears as people's individual vices, their worst fears, the things that construct the absolute worst aspects of them, if that's how they see themselves. So those individuals who are drug addicts, they wish they could escape the habit, they can't escape the habit, and they feel immense amounts of shame and self-deprecation because of that. That's how the White Martian appears to them. This kind of amorphous blob of like various drug tools and so on and so forth, right? A person who's experienced abuse in the past, the White Martian will manifest as that person. It's their worst fears given form. And so once you kind of scale back and you sort of look at what Deniz Camp is doing here, the White Martian literally represents every negative emotion and every negative experience that we as people have ever felt over the course of our lives. If your heart has been broken and you never came back from it, that's what the White Martian represents. If you suffered abuse when you were younger, that's what it represents. If you have experienced homelessness, right? If you have no real feeling of purpose in the world, all these different things, that's what the White Martian represents. It's beautifully handled. It's such a metaphorical comic. And so that's why John Jones says they're all basically desperate for the same thing: a chance. Racing through mullioned light, we were just a minute or two away on foot. The Martian knows more direct paths than A to B, shortcuts through non-Euclidean space. We go through the Sunnyside room by room. The Martian is doing something to the oxygen atoms around my skin, so the heat does not touch me. But the fire is more than fire. The smoke is more than smoke. There are things inside them that refuse to be extinguished. Again, these physical manifestations. And then suddenly, as John Jones is helping to rescue some of these people here, a kind of flaming white woman comes walking out. And he says, as the Martian wrestles with a tangle of anger and alcohol vapors, I suddenly smell burning flesh and icy calm. And that's where this possessed woman says, I have a message for the green one. It knows you're here, hiding in meat. It knows that you're looking. It welcomes you to watch. It loves an audience. And literally this woman just falls over, right? But she does kind of offer a few more statements before she dies. Most people don't get it. They think it's about the fire, but it's not. It's about the smoke. And that's where she kind of says, or really asks with her dying words, but you get it, don't you? Right? That it's all in the smoke, John Jones. And so that's where the story goes from just sort of mysterious to like, what in the world? But I will say, this is one of the most unique comics that's out there right now, if not the most unique comic that's out there right now. I think that's why so many people like it, because it's just so different from what we're traditionally used to when it comes to comic books. But what this does is this initially opens up, right? The ending of this first arc, this initially opens up with John and his wife, Bridget, getting ready to have this gigantic fight. Now, of course, that fight's been a long time coming, if you guys been reading Martian Manhunter or following Absolute Martian Manhunter on the channel, because John is very much just kind of dismissive of his wife, her wants, her needs, and largely focusing on his own thing, which is going to piss anybody off. And he kind of avoids the fight, right? He's like, I've got to go get down to a crime scene. This thing happened. We'll pick this up later, which of course leaves her steaming and leaves her pissed off. But the kicker behind this is that that's not the only reason why she's mad. That as it stands right now, because of the actions of the White Martian, which historically speaking is the antithesis of Martian Manhunter, and basically his arch nemesis within the main DC universe, that here, both Martian Manhunter and the White Martian are far more powerful than they traditionally are in DC Comics. And that what's been happening is that because of the White Martian, the sun has been shining nonstop for 13 days. Even in the shadows, the temperature reaches 103 degrees. And as you guys know, you put a handful of people in a room and you turn the temperature up, tempers are going to start flaring. It's just the nature of people, right? Folks get angry when they get hot. And so what's wild about this is that as time goes on, right, as more and more time passes, that you have these instances where the city starts to descend into madness. Middleton itself. In fact, John Jones says, most in Middleton are either an immigrant or the child of one. Over 130 languages are spoken fluently here. Visions like fields of wildflowers, endless blooming points of view. There are communities from places most Americans have never even heard of, people without countries to go back to. But a second chance takes work. I never saw before now, never understood how much work. Second chances mean living with centuries-old cultural enemies. Second chances mean finding a way to hold on to your language, traditions, and values while adapting to others. For the most part, they make it work, which I can now see as a kind of miracle, and also the most natural thing in the world. And he says, for the most part, on Happy Heart Lane, some people are literally steaming mad. The steam screams in high-pitched outrage. It whistles curses and promises violence and degradation. It signals serious intent. In the bone-white light, which no one else seems to notice, prejudices people worked hard to put away suddenly flare back to vivid life. On day 12 of the heat wave, the thin strip of grass between 961 and 963 Coolidge Road is a war zone. Matt Galvers and Calvin Hill have been neighbors for 20 years. They'd watched each other's kids grow up together, shared a love of craft beers and cars they could never afford. But a long-standing argument over the property line had suddenly exploded into all-out war. These guys are literally donning like military garb, right? And the way that it's depicted here, right? It almost kind of looks like this Vietnam-era battle scene, right? They've got these kind of makeshift walls up. They've got barbed wire, all that kind of stuff. It looks like a war zone. Now, again, how much of this is literal and how much of this is metaphor is up to interpretation, because one of the things that we'll see as we get further into this is that as crazy as some of this stuff looks, it may very well be real. But the real meat and potatoes here, right? What is factual about all of this is the heat is driving people crazy, to the point where we're told each side patrols the makeshift wall 24 hours a day in 8-hour shifts. Even the kids are not spared. The Martians had no luck with the sun, so we try to treat the symptoms. It's temporary relief at best. And so they basically start reminding both sides of the things that they've done for each other, how they've helped each other out. They help them find common ground. They weren't always enemies towards each other. But it's much bigger than this, right? On day 13, there are 13 separate unprovoked police shootings at routine traffic stops, all in one day. The police are red-faced and unrepentant. A million justifications beating on the windows of their own interrogation rooms. The families of the victims are visibly swirling with outrage, revenge fantasies, and carefully planned retaliations. And all the while, Bridget just keeps getting more and more pissed off at John because he's constantly growing more distant, ignoring the fact that she wants to talk to him. It's one of the things that we talked about before. Bids, right? Your husband or wife or whoever looks out the window says, that's a beautiful bird. That's a bid. They want you to look at the bird and then they want you to talk to them about the bird. Acknowledge the fact that they see the world a certain way. And that's what Bridget is doing. But she's literally wanting to talk to her husband and he's constantly blowing her off. And so things continue on, right? Things get violent quickly in the alley. There was a disagreement as to whether a member of the Lucky Strikes bowling team's toe went over the line. A holy war breaks out between the Church of the Lord Redeemer Jesus Christ and the Church of the Redeemer Lord Jesus Christ. They had only split the year before over baptism. One believed a sprinkle was enough. The other called for full submersion. Even some of the church members cannot remember which is which. So literally people are going to war against each other. And we're not talking about yelling matches. We're talking about physical violence, fighting over nonsensical things. Now that's kind of the metaphor, right? Like people oftentimes create differences between one another in order to have a reason to call somebody else an enemy. Does it make sense? No. But if emotions were logical, they wouldn't be called emotions. They would be called logicals. And that's really what all this is focusing on. In the heat wave, people's irrationality and their emotions are getting the better of them. And logic is being replaced by hate, disdain, violence. And so finally, things start catching up to Bridget and John. When he goes to walk out of the house and she's like, you cannot ignore me forever. And initially he almost kind of gaslights her. And his response is, you're imagining things, I'm not avoiding you. His response is to gaslight the hell out of his wife, right? And she's like, we're supposed to be partners, John. And that's where he says, I mean, we are. And that's where she asks, then where have you been? Because the reality here is when you jump into that kind of a marriage like that, you're signing an agreement, right? You're saying, come what may, you and I are partners. Now, sometimes those partnerships don't work out for any number of reasons. But at the end of the day, the goal is to try to find a way to make it work. And it's not one of these situations where there's irreconcilable differences, right? Bridget wants to have kids and John doesn't, right? They're 99% compatible except for that 1%, which is all the difference in the world. Instead, it is John ignoring his wife. And that is a choice that he is making. It's not some situation thrust upon him. And so that's where she says, you've never been one to show your emotions, and I never needed you to be, because I could look into your eyes and I could see what you were thinking. It was almost like your thoughts were written all over your face. And she says, that's why before now, I never doubted our marriage, never doubted how you felt about me and Tyler. And that catches John by surprise because he didn't know she felt that way. But how could he? He was never giving her a chance to express herself and to talk about how she felt, avoiding her every step of the way. And that totally blows him away because he's like, of course I care about you. Like, of course, you guys are the most important things to me, right? You guys are the reason why I do what I do. And he tells her, right? Like, I'm the same man that I've always been. We are partners. And that's when she flies off at the handle, right? And it's kind of amazing the way this is drawn. I want to point that out, right? She's screaming in a red speech bubble and he's talking in a blue speech bubble, right? Fire versus cold, emotion versus rationality. That kind of seems to be what's going on. It doesn't mean that she is out of line in being emotional. Of course she is. She's pissed off. She has every reason to be mad, right? And she was like, you make us move here without any explanation or consultation, right? And he's like, I mean, I did explain, right? It's the Bureau. And she's like, without even any discussion or notice. One day we just picked up and left. We lived in DC for 6 years, John. All our friends were there, and now none of them will return my calls or texts. I must have texted Sam and Evelyn at least a dozen times, and no one will explain to me why. You won't explain why. And his response, I don't really know, but she can see the look on his face that he's lying, because maybe there was something that went on behind the scenes where he betrayed the trust of her friends, and that's why they fled in the first place. Because the reality is that he was made to leave, because there are things that he's not telling her for why he left in the first place. And so again, it kind of continues on. John says, while Bridget and I fight, the Martian fiddles with the sun, like a combination lock. It's distracting, but it seems like he's almost figuring it out, which ultimately he does, right? The Martian Manhunter figures out a way to, quote unquote, get the sun to set and to end the heat wave, which seems like a very literal thing. But when that happens, because the sun is now set and because the heat wave is officially over, as that takes place, 3 guys head to these locations over in Middleton, right? The Middleton nuclear power plant, Middleton coal, and Middleton gas, and they blow up all 3 places. They destroy them all, and it takes down power to the entirety of Middleton in the middle of the night. So quite literally, there's a blackout at night, and that's when things go haywire, because the Martian Manhunter says that was the goal. That was the goal of the White Martian, right? The sun was a distraction. Darkness was White Martian's true intent. And this is where things get nuts, because in that moment, there's this guy, right, in a clown jacket that walks up on this dog and unfortunately takes out the dog, which we can all blame Dennis Camp for doing such a heinous thing. You never kill the dog, Dennis Camp. I don't know why you would do that. But again, it kind of picks up with Martian Manhunter and John as they're investigating all of this. And it's not the first time something like this is happening. And in fact, this is one of the coolest things. And so what he says here is, beneath conscious thought, a charcoal sketch of our perversions, urges, secrets, and pain, our shadow selves, the ones we stuff down and step on and ignore. Well, I guess they've had enough, because the shadows are rising up. Now that is metaphorical, but he's basically talking about people becoming the darkest versions of themselves. He says a coordinated attack on Middleton power stations has left the city in total darkness, and it's hard to say how long it's been. The sun has yet to rise, but I feel certain that weeks have passed. Now, one of the comments of the Martian Manhunter here is very important. He says, great darkness, cosmic darkness, old darkness, darkness before time, before creation, soon will spread, the final night. Now that is an incredibly important statement here, and you guys will see what I'm talking about, right, as we get into it, because it's bonkers, right? But kind of picking back up with John, he says it's one of those nights that seem to go on forever. Everybody knows instinctively that morning will never come. And he says most people hide in the safety of their lightless living rooms. They look out from behind blinds and jump at shadows. And who can blame them? The streets are far from empty despite the hour. Lootings are common in blackouts, but these are different. 2-person teams of teens and their 2-dimensional doubles carry TVs, hair dryers, stereos, and other useless electronic equipment through smashed shop windows. The shadows are a negative influence. Wild teens abandoning everything, establishing new ecstatic religions, perfumed with patchouli and night-blooming jasmine. They dance in front of great fires and hold up their useless loot. Each shadow cast becomes a brief object of worship. They give these new gods new names and new stories, pray and sing, improvise hymns, spill blood in their divine new names, until they get bored and throw it all in the fire, object, shadow, god, and name, and start again. Others worship the light. They pursue it violently. Why? What are they after exactly? Do they want to save it or be saved by it? Do they want to destroy or be destroyed? What he's talking about here is kind of the madness of humanity in what's called a state of nature, right? There's all kinds of ideas when it comes to this, right? Political philosophers call it a state of nature, which is society with no ordered government. And some people who misunderstand the concept might call it anarchy. But the general gist here is this. If you follow like Thomas Hobbes, for example, life is short, brutish, and cruel. And this is a very Hobbesian approach. In a state of nature with no ordered government, society will destroy itself. And that's why society forms the Leviathan, a governing body, if for no other reason than self-preservation. And it's not to say that everyone is given into the madness and everyone is insane. In fact, one of the things that John comments on is the nature of Bridget, right? He says, despite the blackout, Bridget refuses to see me. She was never especially scared of the dark, but she should be. We can't see people clearly in this kind of gloom. To be sure of anything, we have to get up close. I know Bridget can take care of herself. That's one of the amazing things that I love about her. She could always take care of herself, but I wait by the car while the Martian makes sure anyway. And he says certain grocery stores and restaurants promising open all night find themselves in over their heads. The night shift really grinds you down. Long nights like this can be a killer. And so what you find out is that in one of these restaurants, there is a woman here who's grinding up glass. It's an old prison trick, right? To kill somebody, right? You just grind up glass, put it in their food, and slowly kill them over time. And that's what she's doing here. She's putting glass in hamburger meat and then serving the hamburgers to people. Now, of course, John shows up here, catches her in the middle of the act. She realizes what's going on and she takes off into the alley. But again, he continues on, right? I caught a whiff of the secret ingredient as I walked by. Dumb luck. Razor-sharp stars of rage tear up inside of my nose, but even still, I'm tempted. The burgers smell delicious. I walk through the park looking for trouble, but find mostly love and fireflies. Kids play tag with their own shadows. I guess they're on better terms than we are with ours. Maybe our shadow is just another old friend we lose touch with. I realize that even in the moonlight, I cannot tell which is the shadow and which is the real thing. And he says, suddenly, I have a craving for Chacos. Isn't it incredible how good they are at advertising now? Like, they're almost in your head. They've really got it down to a science. Of course, Chacos basically being a kind of cookie, and what you find out is that within this place, someone is injecting Chacos with poison. And in fact, like, Bridget and her kid are there. And initially, Tyler goes to try to grab some, right? And of course, Bridget's like, nope, you don't need that, put it back. So just kind of saves him from destruction. And that leads to John chasing down this guy who was the one poisoning everybody. But he says, we all have a dark side, but we don't have to give in to it. And he says, we all have a choice, don't we? And that's where the Martian says, very sad, sweet, inventive story, partner. And one of the things that they're talking about here is that in this apartment building that they're watching, this dad goes crazy and takes out his whole family and then unalives himself, right? And he says it's too late for any of them, right? We can't save everybody. But in the middle of all that, John is suddenly hit by an ambulance. Now, this is where we get into the importance of all of this, because one of the things to keep in mind is that up until this point, even the Martian Manhunter didn't seem to fully understand what was going on here. And in fact, the Martian Manhunter just kind of appeared in the story all of a sudden, right? And so this is where things get wild. John says, and then I'm swimming through a sea of darkness, or at least the Martian is. And the Martian says, dingy basement of reality, cold, old, endless. And the Martian says, before light, before creation, it was. The white Martian has trapped it, me, us, trapped us all. And he says, after end, post-existence, will be. And so it says the Martian keeps swimming, searching for its center. I think it's trying to understand. Now, of course, while all that's going on, basically it turns out these drivers of the ambulance are just a couple of crazy guys who end up intending to kill John, right? But one of them has a white orb around their head. And that's an important thing because that seems to mean that that person is possessed by the white Martian. But more so than that, the white Martian kind of looks out to its surroundings and it says, obscene dreamer, creations, burning tiger force, cosmic secret origin. And John is kind of seeing all this to a degree as the Martian is seeing it. And John says the nature of the darkness. Bad idea number 0, because the person they witness is Darkseid. Darkseid being the one who, of course, created the absolute universe. And so it seems to be the first time that anyone in the absolute universe is actually beginning to understand what's going on, that this whole thing was created by Darkseid. They're becoming aware of Darkseid. Now, it only seems to be Martian Manhunter and by extension, John, but that's it. But it's the first step in a much larger journey because with knowledge comes awareness. And now they can start telling other people what's truly going on in this place. Because in that moment, when John witnesses Darkseid through Martian Manhunter, he just says, Darkseid is. And Martian says, beginning, end, everything. And that's not the end of the comic, guys, because we still got more. So this is, I told you guys, this comic is so incredible. And so what this does is it kind of switches back to the here and now, right? We sort of leave Darkseid behind, and the Martian Manhunter and John kind of find themselves asking this question: why do people do the things they do? And the response of the Martian: traumatic quantities of pain, damage, despair. And he says, we are coming apart. Overexposure to fundamental reality results in anti-life spiral. And so he says, focus, John Jones. See Bridget and Tyler. See them alone. See them needing you. And so it's basically the kind of strength that John needs, the second wind, in order to fight off these guys who are trying to kill them. And so Martian says, pull yourself, us, everything together. Focus, concentrate, remember what matters. And initially, John kind of starts to give into this darkness, right? Nothing matters. Nothing is important. This is just the nature of humanity, right? He's giving in to his cynicism and arguably, depending on what kind of metaphor you want to use for the story, his depression. And Martian tries to tell John, right? Focus, concentrate, remember what is real. And this guy says, you know it. Everybody knows that nothing here matters. Isn't that right, Bob? And of course, Bob shows John with this kind of orb on his head. He shows him the killer clown, right? The clown killer who's going after Bridget and Tyler. And so in that moment, John realizes his wife and child are in danger. And sure, she's brandishing a shotgun in the face of a guy who has a knife, but still, the desire to keep his family safe overtakes him, and he manages to fight these guys off, if only momentarily, because in that moment, the Martian Manhunter finally shows back up. He says, let us in, out, through, John. And John just says, I need your help. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that up until this point in time, John had always kept the Martian at bay. He never let the Martian in, intentionally. He never let the Martian into his own mind in that way, never allowed himself to join with it. And so that's why the Martian says, we're in this together, partner. And John says the Martian looks. He simply just looks at the one with the saw, and all electrical activity in his brain immediately stops. And so in essence, it's the Manhunter, and really even John, using what's basically telepathy is really what's being described here. Not only that, the Martian Manhunter uses the guy that has the orb for an head as a teleportation system, because at that point you switch back over to the house of Bridget, because this clown killer tells her, your husband cannot help you. The green guy cannot help you. No one can help you. The sun will never rise, and no one's coming. No one sees, not even God. Isn't that freeing, that we alone in all of human history will not be judged? Though somehow I get the feeling that if he did see, he would approve. And in that moment, John just comes teleporting through this guy's head, which is really crazy, right, to be quite honest. But he just tells his wife, right, get out of here, get to the back room, lock the door, keep Tyler safe. I will deal with this. And the fight between the two starts to get pretty intense. But what's kind of wild about this is that while John is fighting the clown killer in his own house, that you have the Martian Manhunter fighting the White Martian. And that's why you have this statement where it says, somewhere very high up, spiritually high, all burning symbol and meaning, I can feel two Martians fighting over Middleton. For them, things made of pure mind, it can all get a little abstract. A punch is not just a punch up there, it's a metaphor. Although that particular metaphor looked like it hurt. And he says, down here, everything's more literal. A punch is just a punch. Violence is just violence. But that's where you get into the God element of this, because what Martian and White Martian start doing is basically using reality warping powers, right? Because what happens is, John says, as the man in the clown jacket tries to spill my brain out onto the hardwood, the White Martian reaches across town into the head of a sleeping boy with terminal brain cancer in apartment 3B. The boy dreams the tumor is as big as the city, and so it becomes as big as the city. It pulses and throbs and seems to smile with crooked, unnatural teeth. Its tendrils reach out, destroying everything they touch. In response, the Green Martian pulls out the revolutionary brain cancer cure that the young girl in 4D of that very same building will help develop 20 years from now. And he says next, the white Martian plucks the fear of the atomic bomb from an aging hippie, 1,000 upturned faces as death traces a screaming rainbow across the sky. The green Martian scrambles to make one small change, tapping into that same hippie's belief in military incompetence. And the bomb is a dud. The war of green and white unfolds the sky into alien geometries and nonsense emotions. With incomprehensible thesis-antithesis weapons, living philosophies debate the life and death of worlds. Reality's crumbling infrastructure is collateral damage. Every mind in Middleton becomes a battleground because they're literally pulling on the thoughts and making the thoughts of every person in Middleton a reality. And John says, me, I stay right here and let nothing get by. Things stopped making sense a while ago. And so that's where the Martian reaches out to John. White flag of victory waving, species-wide tragedy ending imminent. Expand, evolve, enhance your view, see all to save all. Basically, if you don't, everything is going to die because I am losing this fight. And he says, all I see are silhouettes tearing themselves apart in the dark. Despite the darkness, I can see the white Martian is connected to and entangled with the chaos in the streets. I can see that we all are. And that's where the Martian says, white Martian farms, expresses, embodiment, anti-life urges. Why do we do the things we do? And John says, why did I push them away when all I wanted was to hold on till my knuckles turned white? Who was I protecting? Them or myself? What was I so afraid of? And that's where, in this moment, when just all these servants of the white Martian come pouring onto John with the intention of killing him, that Bridget blows the head off of one of them with the business end of a shotgun. And he's like, why couldn't I just talk to my wife? And she looks at him, right? And he just asks, is Tyler okay? And she's like, yes, he's okay. He's safe. But you are hurt. And his response, you were right, Bridget. You were 100% right. I have been hiding, and I don't want to hide anymore. And so John gives himself over fully to the power of the white Martian. And the white Martian says, yes, finally, at last, right? Like epiphanic breakthrough, partial consciousness expansion achieved, unlocked, initiated. And John is just overtaken by what is basically a kind of cosmic awareness, right? But really, it's just unlocking telepathy on a global level. And he says, suddenly it's clear as day. I see all of Middleton, the people on the streets, at least 3/4 mad, running from their own shadows, fighting fire and loss, seeing senseless violence everywhere they turn, incomprehensible forces clashing on battlefields between their ears, as their beautiful, brightly colored lives spill out from them. And so the Martian tells him, right, show them, let them see each other as you, I, we see them, as they see themselves. Upgrade, and where he asks how, he's told upgrade unlocks new ability, knowledge, perceptions. Open their eyes. And so it's very reminiscent of that moment from Silver Surfer Requiem, right? Where the gift that Silver Surfer gives to humanity is a moment of cosmic awareness, where they can truly see how they're all connected. And that's what John does. John uses his newfound powers to tell everyone, breathe in the emotions of other people, essentially. And that's what they do. And when that happens, everybody starts experiencing everybody else's past, their loves, their hurts, the things they got right, the things they got wrong, all the things they never said that they wish they had said, and all the things they said that they wish they never said. All these things, these regrets, and the beauty that is human life, because everyone has their own traumas, but everybody also has their own fantastic achievements. And what the white Martian was trying to build on was divisiveness. That person is different than you, and because they're different, they're bad. Whereas the Martian Manhunter, and through John, was making the argument, that person is different from you. And there's something dope that you can learn about them because of that, right? There's a way in which the two of you can connect if you have an open mind and are receptive to the fact that you alone are not the center of the universe, and you're not the most important person in the world, and you never were. And in that moment, with all that coalescing together, it gives the Martian Manhunter the ability to kill and defeat the White Martian. And the day is saved, which is amazing. Now, of course, that leads to the sun finally rising yet again. And that's where things get a little ambiguous, right? Did this all just happen in one night? Or was it happening over a series of successive nights? Again, metaphor versus realism. But this story is incredible. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. This is probably one of the greatest comic book stories that I've ever read in my entire life. It was phenomenal. But thank you all for watching. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.